Making restitution. When we have wronged someone, we should do all we can to make restitution. Here now is Gene Getz.
In Numbers chapter 5, verse 7, the person is to confess the sin he has committed. He is to pay full compensation, add a fifth of its value to it, and give it to the individual he has wronged. Now, if you go into the total context, again, you will see that this is a principle that relates to a very specific situation there in the Old Testament. And so God had to establish a set of rules and laws because all of these carnal people coming out of Egypt, and many of them idolaters and immoral, and for 400 years their lives had been permeated with the evil of Egypt. And so they come out of Egypt, and God is beginning not at ground zero, but below ground zero, and being able to bring them to a place where they understand what His laws are and how they should relate to each other. They had to learn to love God and one another, their neighbor as themselves. And so God is dealing with some specific situations here, and remember that the laws that He established were related to their whole governmental system. They were a self-contained system. They didn't have a government outside of themselves. They didn't have laws outside of themselves. All of this was a total system that God established in order for them to survive through the wilderness and then on into the land of Canaan. So this making restitution here comes from a very specific example, but it also gives us a very significant principle, which Jesus reinforced. Because if you go to Matthew chapter 5, Jesus, of course, is speaking out of the Hebrew system here, talking about the temple. He's talking to the Pharisees. He's talking to religious leaders. He's talking to the children of Israel. And he said, so if you're offering your gift on the altar, which the children of Israel did, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. In other words, this is a form of restitution, of making right. Before we try to worship God, we need to deal with these issues that involve offense between a brother or sister in Christ. Now, the fact of the matter is, we may try to deal with it, and they will not respond to us or forgive us or whatever. Then it no longer ceases to be our problem, it's their problem. But the fact is, Jesus is dealing with the fact that we need to deal with the issue, try to make that issue right through a form of restitution in order to worship God with freedom. Now we have an illustration, a significant illustration, in the Gospel of Luke, a guy by the name of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. In fact, he was a chief tax collector. And he had a downline. You see, in the Roman Empire, this was a very corrupt system. If you want to be a tax collector, you could buy into it. And then the Roman government would give you the permission to collect taxes. But they also had unwritten rule, basically, that once you collected what the Roman government should get, you could get as much out of people as you want. You could cheat them out of life and limb. And that's why the tax collectors were grouped together with sinners. Tax collectors and sinners. Tax collectors and sinners. They were a hated group of people. Now, Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. By the way, Matthew was also a tax collector. We don't know where he was. He may have had his own downline and probably was a very, very wealthy man before he became a follower of Jesus. And Zacchaeus probably was much more wealthy. In fact, he said this to the Lord, and I don't think it's hyperbole. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, I'll give half of my possessions to the poor. Lord, and if I have extorted anything from anyone, I'll pay back 4 times as much. Now, you've got to have a deep well to make that statement. The wealth among some of these individuals was incomprehensible in Jerusalem at this time. And so Jesus really put his finger on this guy. And he wanted to follow Jesus. Remember, he climbed up in the sycamore tree, and then he became a believer. And Jesus said, "Today salvation has come to this house." Jesus told him because he too is the son of Abraham. Now, question, does that mean that he couldn't receive Christ or have salvation until he made everything right? No. That's not what the Bible teaches. We can receive Jesus Christ and be saved. Then begins the process of restitution. Now the question is, to what extent is it necessary for a Christian who has wronged someone, particularly in an economic sense, to go beyond asking for forgiveness and to make restitution? Boy, I don't have a specific answer for all of that, especially in our culture, where you have all of these rules of bankruptcy and all of these situations that can become incredibly complex. Because in some cases it's a lifetime, it's impossible. But I know one thing, I know some Christians who go through bankruptcy and they make sure that they deal with it the best they can in making restitution to everybody they possibly can, because they're Christians. And I think that's the principle. Now, I think we can be oversensitive. I think we can let our conscience bother us about things that we have to put under the blood of Jesus, because there's some things we just can't make up for. We can ask forgiveness, but we can't make up for it in terms of healing and those issues. It just so happened that I grew up in a religious system where I was taught that restitution, once you became a follower of Jesus, was very, very important. Now, the problem was that they mixed works, and they taught that if you didn't make restitution, then God wouldn't forgive you. And once you made restitution for everything, then God would forgive you. And that's not biblical. That puts a person between a rock and a hard place, because God gives us salvation through faith regardless of our past. But then begins the process of restitution. But I took that very seriously. And I remember one illustration to show you how your conscience can prick you and maybe be oversensitive. But I remember when I was in the second grade, I was 7 years old. And believe me, that is a long time ago, over 70 years ago. And I remember just as clear as can be that we had these wonderful softballs. And I wanted a softball so bad. And for some reason, my parents evidently didn't buy me a softball. But it doesn't make an excuse for what I did. As a 7-year-old, I remember one day, just as clear as can be, coming in from the playground with that softball, brand new. And I remember putting it in my coat pocket, in the closet. It was in wintertime, or it was cold, and I had a coat. And I stole that softball. My parents came to me and said, "Where'd you get this softball?" "Oh, I found it in the ditch." So you see, stealing led to lying. Now, I was 7 years old. I remember doing that, very deliberate, and just went on about business, had a lot of fun playing with that softball. Well, I remember I became a Christian. And for some reason, that just kept coming back to my mind. Gene, you stole that softball. You need to replace it. And I kept saying, "Lord, that's ridiculous. They'll think I'm stupid. That's dumb." I mean, that ball back then would cost about $2.50. Right now, it'd be worth $5 or 10 or whatever. But, Lord, you've forgiven me, and then I'd put it out of my mind. And then I'd be somewhere, be thinking about it, and all of a sudden, my conscience would come into play, and I remember that softball. Now, you could psychoanalyze this and say, I had an obsession, a compulsion, because of my religious background, what I was taught, a false sense of guilt, etc., etc. And that's probably to a certain extent true. But it never stopped bothering me periodically. And I remember I was through Moody Bible Institute. I was ministering in Billings, Montana. I was in a meeting. I was thinking about my walk with the Lord, and popped into my head, Gene, you need to make that right. And I argued with the Lord and said, Lord, all these years have gone by. Finally, one day I said, I'm going to solve this problem once for all. Obsession or whatever it is, I'm going to solve this problem once for all. So I wrote a letter to the principal back at old Madeiraville High School. I had 12 grades in one school. His name was Ralph Harris. I said, Mr. Harris, when I was in the second grade, I stole a softball. And it just keeps bothering me that I need to take care of that. And so I calculated the money, the inflation of what that softball would cost to replace it. I don't know how much it was, but it was considerably more than what it was in 70 years before that. And so consequently, not 70 years, I'm talking from 70 now, but back then it was quite a few years. And so I put that money in an envelope and I wrote him a letter and sent it to him. I didn't hear anything. And by the way, I never had another obsessive thought. I mean, that solved that problem. Whether it was Satan coming at me or just an obsession or whatever it was, I dealt with it. Well, I went back, left Montana, and I came back home to Indiana, and I was talking with my mom. And she said, by the way, Gene, I thought you would really be interested in knowing that Ralph Harris, after all these years, the principal at Madeiraville School, was fired. I said, he was fired. He said, yeah, he got, I guess, crossways with the board, something happened, and he was fired. And I said, wow, Mom, thanks for telling me. So I got in the car, I drove up to the town, and I found Mr. Harris. And I walked in and I said, sir, I said, I'm just really sorry to hear what happened to you. And I just want you to know I really appreciate your leadership as the principal of that school. All the time I was there and subsequently, and I'm sorry. I don't know what the circumstances are, but I just wanted to express to you my appreciation to you. And this rather crusty guy, he was tough. He could be really tough. In fact, he would deal with situations. The story around school was he had a paddle in his office and had holes in it. And once in a while, a guy would really get in trouble, and you could hear him give whacks. And, you know, with holes in a paddle, it stings a lot more. And he gave a few of those. So he was a crusty old guy, but he was really a strong principal, had values. Don't know whether he was a Christian, though I think he claimed to be. And when I walked up to him, tears filled his eyes. And what do you think he told me? He said, Gene, that letter and that money made my whole career worth it. Thank you. Thank you. How do I evaluate that? Well, in God's timing, all those years later, he used it in a man's life. Simply because I made restitution. Did I need to? Not necessarily. But I think God used it. And so I often think about that, and I certainly couldn't help but think about it when I forged out this principle. When we've wronged someone, in this case, it wasn't against him, it was really against the school. When we have wronged someone, we should do all we can to make restitution. And perhaps God will use it in a very special way.